Good evening, everyone. I'm Nadia Valman, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, marking the 50th anniversary of the publication of Outcast London, Gareth Stedman Jones' landmark study of poverty and responses to it in Victorian London, which was itself, of course, published on the centenary of the Paris Commune. And this webinar has been organised by Anna Maguire, Lindsay Jenkins and Colm Murphy, and it's brought to you by the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary, in collaboration with the Modern British History Seminar and the Raphael Samuel History Centre. And I'm the co-director of the centre, and we're especially pleased to support this event. In the 2013 preface to the reissue of Outcast London, Gareth writes movingly about the conversations that he had during the writing of the book with his late friend, Raphael Samuel, with whom he walked the East London streets that were in 1971 still recognisably the streets of dockers, market porters and tailors. So tonight's webinar will be an opportunity to explore the longer life of those conversations. And I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Rob Saunders, who will be our chair.
Well, good evening. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you to this celebration of a book that has been influencing and inspiring scholars from all kinds of different disciplines now for half a century. Outcast London belongs to a really rare category of academic books. It is both an enormous pleasure to read and a book that is packed full of statistical information and detail. It is a book that is still not only still read 50 years after it was first published, but that is still inspiring new scholarship and new lines of research. And it's a book that is about a particular time and place, but that speaks to all kinds of contemporary concerns that feel as fresh today as they did when the book was first written. Things like the casualisation of the labour force, the housing crisis, immigration, policing and protest, the idea of London as a problem, the perhaps rather strange relationship between left-wing intellectuals and a workforce that was often resistant to their charms. So I'm delighted not only that we can celebrate Outcast London today, but that we have such a wide-ranging panel of speakers to help us to do so, and to think about the relationship between Outcast London and their own research and scholarship. We're going to hear from all 6 of our speakers in turn, and then we'll also have a reflection from Gareth himself, looking back at Outcast London 50 years on. We are very keen this evening to feed in your own comments and questions. So please do type those into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and I will put them to the panelists on your behalf. So let's start with our first speaker. Sunil Amrith is Professor of History at Yale University, and he is a distinguished historian of South and Southeast Asia. But he began his academic career in Outcast London, where he was part of the team that runs the History Workshop Journal. He has a particular interest in the history of migration and in environmental history, so there are lots of really interesting points of contact with Gareth's work. And Sunil, we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for including me. If I may begin on a personal note, the legacy of Outcast London has shaped my thinking and my career in profound ways through the broader intellectual milieu that it arose from and in turn created. I spent the first decade of my career in London, as Rob just pointed out, and throughout those years I served on the editorial collective of History Workshop Journal, alongside Gareth, alongside many of his longtime collaborators, colleagues, interlocutors. To have a close-up glimpse of that intellectual tradition, vibrant and constantly in renewal, was an amazing privilege for a young scholar, as I was then, and it has stayed with me, perhaps more so than is immediately evident in my own writing. Outcast London has, for a start, been in long dialogue with my own field of South Asian history, particularly in the work of labour historians. And the most direct connection for me was through the work of one of my earliest teachers, one of Gareth's students, the late Raj Chandavarkar. Chandavarkar's 1994 book, The Origins of Industrial Capitalism in India, refers to outcast London frequently. Bombay, like London, was a city built on precarious labor, on its docks and also in its cotton mills. Bombay, like London, faced an acute shortage of housing. And of course, Bombay and London were umbilically linked by Victorian capitalism and the structures of empire. In Bombay, the spectre of the disorderly urban poor worried not just British colonial officials, many of them imbued with exactly the Victorian ideas that Gareth excavates in his book, but also by the Indian elite, a tension that ended up at the heart of the Gandhian mass movement. In later years, just as in British history, some of the most important work on labor and precarity in South Asia would take up the gender dimension, which was not central to either outcast London or the origins of industrial capitalism. The work of Samita Sen on women's labor in jute factories, for instance, or of Mrinalini Sinha on how both gender and race shaped the global discourse on India's poverty. My most recent reading of outcast London, however, led me in an unexpected direction. I've started to think of it also as a work of environmental history. At one level, that is anachronistic. Environmental history did not really develop as a field until later. And what we now think of as environmental concerns played, I think, no part in motivating the writing of the book. Though perhaps there's an interesting coincidence of timing. Just the year after Outcast London was published, the UN held its first conference on the global environment in Stockholm, where India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi framed the environmental crisis as primarily a problem of poverty. But what struck me most in my recent rereading of Outcast London is something that had completely escaped my notice on earlier readings, and that is the centrality of climate to the story. The harsh winters of the second half of the 19th century are such a powerful presence in these pages. Some of the worst periods of distress in Victorian London, Stedman Jones wrote, were the result not so much of cyclical trade depressions as exceptionally hard winters. He quotes Reynolds' news from 1854-55. The navigation of ships, steamers, and boats is entirely stopped, and the docks are blocked up. The distress among the laboring classes caused by the suspension of labor is appalling. I flipped to the index of Outcast London, and to my surprise found as many references to winter as to unemployment. There is something strangely contemporary about all of this. The new climate history has in recent years made ever larger claims for the causal impact of the Little Ice Age on patterns of historical change. Geoffrey Parker's book on the 17th century crisis, Victor Lieberman's on state formation across Eurasia, so many others. And the second half of the 19th century, we now know, marked the final phase of this Little Ice Age. But Outcast London saw this. In tables 11 and 12 of the appendices, there's a wealth of data showing that in the 30 years from 1865 to 1895, there were 15 winter months with a recorded average temperature of 34 degrees Fahrenheit or less. And between 1895 and 1925, not a single one. Only partly tongue-in-cheek, I thought to myself that today such a finding would be published in Nature as a revelation of the new climate history. It hardly needs saying that the ever greater accuracy of historical climatological data has been of enormous importance to climate science, allowing for more accurate modeling and understanding of anthropogenic climate change. But in terms of how we understand climate as a factor affecting people's lives, it may well be a case of going back to the future. Because the story Outcast London tells actually runs counter to the story that would become the dominant one, and that is the conquest of nature narrative. It is the narrative we get from an equally fine urban history from a decade later, William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, from so many other works of environmental history. Cronin wrote of railroads' liberation from geography, their ability to operate quite independently of the climatic factors that had bedeviled earlier forms of transportation. Yet in Outcast London, what Gareth calls a seasonality remains a central fact of life in the lives of the working classes. Seasonality of production, seasonality of employment, seasonality of supplies. The arrival of grain and timbers was primarily affected by climatic factors, he wrote, with a profound impact on dock labor. Because of London's global position, local employment was bound up with multiple rhythms of seasonality and climatic fluctuation, hemispheric, regional, and local. Yes, steamships changed this to some extent, but never entirely, and they did nothing to promote more secure employment. If we were to take this insight from Outcast London and look outward, we could connect it through London's role as a port city and the heart of imperial power with the even more devastating impact of seasonality on cultivators across Asia and Africa in the late Victorian famines that Mike Davis wrote about so searingly, and which, as Priya Satya has recently emphasized, ideologies of race and empire rendered invisible. As capital investments from London changed the landscape of the earth, raising forests for rubber plantations in Malaya, mining gold in South Africa, extracting oil in Burma, Outcast London tells the inner history of this process in the transformation of central London itself. Its escalating land values pricing out the poor who had nowhere else to go. Outcast London tells us that at the height of the city's wealth and power, there could be no conquest of nature for the poorest people. And that perhaps is the most prescient lesson of all. The contemporary resonance with the port cities of Asia today, at the front line of climate change, dependent on precarious labor, is not difficult to miss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful start. And I'm sure there'll be lots of things there that we would like to come back to. Our second speaker is Emma Griffin, who is the Professor of Modern British History at the University of East Anglia. She's also the President of the Royal Historical Society. And similarly, she brings a really interesting range of expertises towards the discussion tonight. She's currently writing a book on global industrial revolutions, and she's part of a digital history project that works particularly with the census to explore the fate of handloom weavers during the Industrial Revolution. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you very much for the invite. And thank you everybody for coming here and listening. It's incredible to be talking about such an influential book with so many other interested people. And I mean, it's lovely that we're on Zoom, and I think there are lots more of us here than there would be otherwise. But I also have a slight sense of regret that we're not somewhere in the East End, which seems so germane to the book, and is also part of my own journey and my own story, because I first encountered this book in particular, and everything that kind of led me to where I am all started at Queen Mary in Westfield, as it was in the early 90s, which is where I started a history degree in 1992, I think it was. And I found out all about Outcast London and was introduced to it quite early in my studies, because at that point, one of Gareth's students had recently been appointed as a lecturer at Queen Mary's. That was Daniel Pick. Daniel had written his thesis and his first book on degeneration in late 19th century European thought. And his work, that work had been done in the 1980s, that had been really heavily influenced by parts of Outcast London and supervised by Gareth, and all of that was filtering through into his teaching and reaching reaching many of us who I think may not necessarily have encountered it in any other way. And I'm always just really interested in the kind of the genealogy of historians, and I think there's like a really clear trail of students of Gareth's that have kind of gone all around the UK and influenced many of us and set us on our way in a real wide variety of ways. So that's how I kind of came across Outcast London. I think when you encounter something as an undergraduate, you receive it in certain ways. It's a really large book. It's a really large book in ways that I hadn't realised as an undergraduate. And I mean, one of the things that I think is really, I mean, it's a Penguin book. Penguin books can be really big books, but it wasn't what felt like a big book in the 1990s, which would have been a hardback book and a university press book and would have appeared slightly differently. I mean, this was a book I could afford. It was in paperback. It had a picture on the cover, and yeah, I think it's just a really big book with just a huge scope. And it's been picked up and used by many of us in really different ways. One of the things that I think I didn't recognise then, but which seems really clear to me kind of going back to it now, is that in many ways it's a piece of economic history, or it's certainly what economic history looked like in the 1970s when it first appeared, in the 1960s. In fact, it's like the best example. One of the, is as good as economic history got. Like, economic history looks very different nowadays. But I think what Gareth was doing here with his work on the economy, on occupational structure, on employment, on housing, on geography, it was all trying to tell us how the London economy and society really was, what it really looked, what its actual features were in the way that economic history did at the time. As Gareth said in his preface to the volume that I've got, most of the attention has always focused on the final third of the book, the middle class London and the problem of the casual poor. And that's certainly how I encountered it as an undergraduate as well. And that's certainly what stayed with me for the longest. And there's a lot to say about why I think that final third of the book was very influential, very resonant at this particular time, and why so many of us wanted to think about those ideas and dissect those ideas and travel with those ideas, because they're just very rich and take us lots of directions. But for me, I guess there are two things, looking back at all of that moment, it seems there are a number of things about his argument that stand out as being particularly kind of fruitful for us. Because one of them is the suggestion that the emergence of discourse and debate and ideas and solutions around poverty, that moment might have something other to do with something other than enlightenment, a kind of a growing understanding, a growing awareness of the problem, a kind of a progressive movement where people started to realise the nature of the problem and put in place benevolent solutions to it. And his argument that it might be something like guilt, it might be something like fear, rather than kind of contrition or enlightenment, or kind of seeing the error of their ways, something that there might be something dark, and that the development of social policy might not be a simple story of a simple positive and progressive story about moving towards kind of better times. And I think that was kind of rich and very, clearly very remarkable for the 1970s, where people weren't accustomed to thinking so critically about things that we tend to look back on now and view as progress, as kind of unpacking that kind of way of approaching it. I think the other thing that is going on that perhaps was provocative and got people thinking and wanting to think about is, and although I think it's not part of the kind of the main framework or motivation of the book, I think one of the things that one takes away from it is that a Marxist analysis doesn't explain events in late 19th century London or developments in social policy, or actually anything else very much at all. And as we kind of get further and further away from this period, the decline of Marxist thought in historiography, the decline of the influence of Marxist historians seems very obvious and perhaps overdetermined. But I think that could be very easily forgotten, that actually when this work was being produced in the 1970s, there was still a lot of interest in trying to make sense of British history within a Marxist framework. And this was a very powerful attempt to make sense of our past, particularly during this period of industrialization, without using that kind of framework. So all fits in, Outcast London fits into a really large literature about poverty, the treatment of the poor, the causes and consequences of the poor. And there was a lot of debate. I think there was a lot of historiography, a lot of interest in kind of the emergence of social policy as a historical topic. And that was where I started my kind of research career, and it's where I started with my MA dissertation back in the 1990s. One of the other things I think that's really interesting is that by the time I was working on poverty in the 1990s, Gareth's article about the languages of class had also appeared. And I think in some ways that article actually invited us to rip up a lot of what's said in that final third of Outcast London and think again about the language about poverty. I mean, just at the simplest, if you go back to, Mearns, Bitter Cry of Outcast London, all these other texts that, these texts coming out of the 1880s and the 1890s, they never use the word poverty. It's just not the word that they use. They're using a different language altogether. So it was quite interesting, I think, to kind of come back to that field that he's sketched out, but also use a kind of a later set of ideas to get into that and think about it. Well, just a couple of other points before I finish, because we don't want to talk too long. I want to hear what people in the audience have to say. By the time that I was planning my PhD in the 1990s, I think a lot of the steam was running out of debates about poverty and social problem. When I first thought about doing a PhD, my original thought was I would work on this wonderful, lively topic of historical debate and think about poverty in the late 19th century city. When I put that proposal to Daniel Pick, he said, no, this has become a bit tired, you know, maybe I'm just a bit jaundiced, but maybe you want to kind of think about another field. Maybe you know, we've talked about this enough now. But that was actually really hard to do in the 1990s, to just pivot to another topic, because there's no internet. You just kind of get told this and then you're at home with but it's very hard to kind of come up with ideas, and the kind of connections with what other people are doing were completely different in this point. And I tried to pivot the proposal to something slightly different and applied to do the PhD at Cambridge with Gareth. And he said actually exactly the same thing. I think this is a little bit tired. I don't think this is quite what you want to do. You want to go somewhere else with your research now. And I think actually that's a really amazing legacy in some ways, that you've kicked off a debate that's become so lively that you don't even want to be part of it anymore. And I think that's part of what happened. But I just want to close with just a couple of other, well, just one other thing really that I've taken away and that I take away from the book. So I think the book kind of has this tripartite structure of the labour market. You know, this is how, you know, the labour situation actually was, occupational structure, this is what it was like, what wages were like, and the stuff on the housing, and then that final part about the middle class debate about poverty. And I suppose by this point I was moving away from the idea of looking at the middle class debate about poverty. But what I love about the book, and I think what's made it so durable, is in fact, despite this tripart structure, we don't have these things viewed in complete isolation. Everything is intertwined all through the book. There's always a kind of intertwining of the occupations the working class people had and the debate around the way that they were living. And I think for me, that's the thing that I take away and carry, and probably is the most significant legacy for me, that in fact, that's ended up completely unpredictably and without kind of a clear steer. That for me is the point of interest. And I think for me, Outcast London is just a model of how understanding how this social history, basically, it's a model of social history. And all through the 1990s, we were moving away from social history as a way of studying the past and moving towards cultural history. But I think in some ways, it's a really fine piece of social history that puts people's lives and experiences at the very center of what it does. And that's what I guess that's what I try, what I've been trying to do as well for the past 20 years, whatever it is now. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Emma. So our third speaker is Thomas Jones, who is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Birmingham. And he has a book forthcoming, which is particularly relevant to today's subject, called Liberty's Exile, A History of Political and Religious Asylum in Britain from the Reformation to the 20th century. He was also supervised by Gareth, and he assisted in the research for the 2013 edition of Outcast London. So it's very good to have you, Thomas, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's actually the University of Buckingham rather than the University of Birmingham. But as Robert has noted, maybe my strongest claim for relevance on this panel is that I assisted with the research for the 2013 edition of Outcast London, which is this one. I helped Gareth with the research for both the preface and to select some new images. Very close readers may have noticed that there are different images in the 2013 edition than in the 1971 or 1984 edition. And rereading Outcast London today, so much of what struck me about the book, alongside things that have already been said by Robert, Emma, about the sort of continuing strengths of the first two sections of the book, and the force of language and the lucidity of the argumentation, comes back to the conversations that Gareth and I had in 2012, 2013, when we were putting this new edition together. So I thought I would sort of review a little bit of that, discuss a little bit of that, and then maybe talk a little bit about how I think some of those conversations might go were we to hold them today. And one thing that comes through very strongly, I think, in the 2013 preface is a sense that Gareth and I discussed a lot in those months, which was that the London described in Outcast London in many ways was beginning to bear more of a resemblance to the London of today, or the London of 2012, 2013, than the London of the late 1960s when the book was first written. And this is, as I say, a sort of major feature of the last 10 pages or so of the 2013 preface. Gareth talks about the decline of industry being a major structural factor in London's economy. Of course, now the decline of major manufacturing concerns that had emerged in the interwar period, rather than the casualization of small-scale manufacturing or the final collapse of the long-suffering silk weaving industry. Alongside that, there was, of course, a significant rise in unemployment, underemployment, deunionization when compared to the late 1960s when the book was written. There's a lot of statistical information in the 2013 edition, which paints a very stark picture about this. And I think now we might add references to the increased use of food banks. We might use the term the gig economy, which I'm not sure if it had quite gained purchase in 2012, 2013, but which encapsulates so much about the increasingly casualized nature of the labor market in the city today. Alongside of that, there's the increased power and prevalence of finance, of insurance, of other sort of major services, and their imposition of themselves on the central districts of London, rather than sort of taking over the city, as is very evocatively described in Outcast London. There's Canary Wharf being transformed in the years after the Big Bang. And in one of my favorite sentences from the 2013 preface, Gareth describes the new Canary Wharf as perhaps the ultimate realization of Mrs. Thatcher's vision of a social aggregation instead of a society. But alongside those developments, there's perhaps a more optimistic one. There's the repopulation of the central districts of London. After many decades of social policy, purposefully pushing people and work out of the central districts, central London began to regain population in the decades after, certainly the 1980s, and its relative share of London's population has increased. And one set of perhaps more happy results from that has been a rise of the creative industries in London. Gareth describes in the 2013 preface the beautification of the riverside, the restoration of major cultural amenities, many of which date from the Victorian era. And I think maybe looking back from 2021 and adding to some of the discussions we had in 2012, 2013, one might also note perhaps increased pressure on housing. This is perhaps a less happy result of some of the population flows I was just describing. It's very striking to read in Outcast London today that in 1887, workers in the central districts of London tended to pay about 20 or 30% of their wages on rent. Those are figures that I think many Londoners would recognize today or even envy today. Relatedly, I think we might make more of the theme of immigration. Immigration from the rest of the United Kingdom, but also from overseas, which has in recent decades, as in the 1870s, 1880s, been held as a key driver of casualization, a key driver of decreasing wages for native-born Londoners, a key driver of higher property prices. And I think both today and in the 1880s in ways that maybe don't come very much to the fore in the book in any of its 3 editions, is the racialization of those discussions. London, of course, today is a far more international, far more cosmopolitan city than it was in the late 19th century. But of course, in the Victorian era, it was notable and noted as the most cosmopolitan or international city in the United Kingdom. And Eastern European Jewish immigration in particular was discussed in heavily racialized terms. And that theme in particular has sort of leads me to some sort of final thoughts that I want to impart. I'm not going to talk about, well, I want to sort of think a little bit about how, were someone to write a book like Outcast London today, or were Outcast London to be published and received today, how might it be written or received differently? Emma has just sort of talked about the decline of Marxist historiography, and Gareth himself in the 1984 edition of Outcast London and in Languages of Class discusses his changing attitudes towards how he used class as a analytical framework. So I'm not going to sort of go into that and into sort of the linguistic turn and things like that. But I think if this book were written now, probably there would be much more of an emphasis on how immigration played into the fears described in the final third of the book. Arnold White, for example, appears several times in Outcast London, but from my count, from my most recent rereading, his attitudes towards immigration only come up once. It's a sort of almost a side remark that ending immigration from abroad would be one of his planks in his plan to sort of save the nation. And I think that in an analysis that focuses so much on ideas about national hygiene, social Darwinism, eugenicist thinking, the relative absence, not complete absence, of discussions about fears about the consequences of Eastern European Jewish immigration might play a greater role. But speaking of emotion, I think that the central role of fear in the book might hit an audience a bit differently today. In 1984, Gareth talks about how that was one of the least popular aspects of Outcast London when it first came out, one of the least well-reviewed aspects of it. And I think now, living in an era as we do, with a much more theoretically sophisticated and widely researched field of the history of emotions, placing fear at the center of the relationships that Gareth describes would, I think, be more welcomed now than it was then. And my very final point is that I think that Gareth's attempts to get away from what he described as English parochialism, notably in his use of French and other continental European thought, resonates, I think, with me in the current moment that we're living in. Gareth describes in 2013, looking back at 1971, that he had a desire to look beyond what then seemed the complacent verities of a common sense Anglo-Saxon empiricism and explore alternative philosophical traditions. And I think that could be a clarion call, if not for historians today, and probably for many of them, then certainly for our own wider political discourse of the moment. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I can definitely get our next speaker's university right because we work at the same place. So Alastair Owens is Professor of Historical Geography at Queen Mary and head of the School of Geography. And he's also a trustee of the Ragged School Museum in East London. He's currently working on Anglicanism in the inner city in the 1970s, but a lot of his research in the past has focused on Victorian London and has often involved working with London heritage organisations. So again, he brings a lot of very interesting and relevant experience to the discussion of Outcast London. So Alastair, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Rob, and thank you again to the organisers for the invitation. So my perspective then is that of a geographer or historical geographer, and Outcast London has been a rewarding read for many geographers, and I think several like David Green or Richard Dennis have actually been quite key in taking some of its themes forward. But the volume also spurred, I would argue, a wider interest in geographical issues and in many different ways an appreciation of the significance of space in understanding the later Victorian metropolis. In fact, I don't think it's inappropriate to say that space has become a core theme in the historiography of London. So what I'm going to do is to pick out some key areas where Gareth's book has stimulated geographical thinking and analysis about London. For me, it was actually part one of the book, the bit of the book that's about the city's economy and its labour market, that grabbed me when I first read Outcast London as a student in the early 1990s. A wannabe student of economic history at the time, a road that I very nearly went down, London's alternative route to industrialisation maps so vividly in Gareth's book. So the lack of factories, the persistence of small-scale production, the low capital entry and limited technology requirements, the subcontracting, the de-skilling of the workforce, the gendered nature of the labour market, and the sweated systems of labour. Those were all things that I found extraordinarily fascinating. And as Gareth's book showed, there was a distinctive geography to London's manufacturing industry with a clustering of activities in different localities. So we could think of, for example, watch and precision instrument making in Holborn, or furniture making in Shoreditch, or cheap clothes down the road from Queen Mary in Whitechapel. These made up the inner industrial perimeter, something that I love to point out on walks to my completely disinterested children. And as Gareth shows, these areas were experiencing significant change from the 1860s, resulting in the emergence of the casual labour market in the East End. In the mid-1990s, I attended a memorable symposium, the papers from which were later published in the London Journal, which included contributions from people like David Green, but also Paul Johnson, Leonard Schwartz and Martin Daunton, which pushed against Gareth's claim that the effect of the Industrial Revolution on London was to accentuate its pre-industrial characteristics. And in different ways, they mounted an alternative reading suggesting that Victorian London's economy and the economic geography of Victorian London was in fact peculiarly modern, almost post-industrial in its characteristics. So here were localized communities of skill bound by deep networks and close subcontracting, operating flexibly and able to offer just-in-time production, highly responsive to a fluctuating consumer demand, but also deeply exploitative, gendered, and maybe less politically organised than elsewhere. So the richly evidenced account of the city's industrial ecology in Outcast London has been highly significant, I think, in prompting challenges to narratives of the Industrial Revolution and its economic geographies, and in demonstrating alternative paths to mass production. And if it makes no sense to describe Victorian London's economy as post-industrial, and I'm not really convinced it does actually, perhaps this labelling at least draws our attention to the persistence of the casual labour problem, a feature of our own times too, as others have said. So what would Henry Mayhew have written about the ever-present gaggle of delivery riders outside KFC on the Mile End Road? Outcast London also underscored the global reach of London's economy and the huge significance of finance, commerce and imperial extraction, something that has become a concern of economic and financial historians writing since. But if Gareth's book in the end looked more economically inward than outward, it still perhaps is one of the starting points to a now well-established theme of scholarship exploring London as a city profoundly shaped by its empire. And here I think of the geographer Doreen Massey and her simple but insightful contention that we can never really begin to understand the history of a place without thinking about how it's been shaped by its connections to other places. Those connections were economic and tied the casual labour problem to a wider imperial system, as scholars like Jonathan Schneer have demonstrated and others have debated. Stimulated by equally influential scholarship, such as contributions from Catherine Hall and Sonia Rose, and also a wider interest in post-colonial perspectives, the colony-metropole relationship has become a productive area of inquiry, with many studies exploring how empire shaped life in London. And here I might just give a quick plug to two of my own former students who've published books this year, Kristin Hussey on empire and medical practice in late Victorian London, and Laura Humphreys on how metropolitan domestic labour and culture was shaped by the non-British world. Such work looks outward from London, but one wonders if there is a project to write an economic and social history of London from offshore, as it were, viewed from the places elsewhere in the world that fed the city's hunger for raw materials, products and people, and which interlocked with people's efforts to make a living in the metropolis itself. But let me come back to London. One of the core themes running through Gareth's book is a growing sense of geographical division that characterises the city and that becomes central to the way that Outcast London is conceived of. It also shapes the charitable intervention and the development of social policy towards the poor. So the problem of Outcast London is associated with the east of the city, rooted in understanding its economic crises, the book argues, but also a product of the physical separation of the middle and upper classes from the poor. This polar sense of London, a city of east and west extremes, became formative in the late 19th century and has also been a dominant theme in the many cultural histories of the metropolis that have followed Outcast London. So interest was encouraged by Peter J. Keating's early edited collection of writings by social explorers, and then later by Gareth and David Feldman's 1989 collection of essays, Metropolis London. But it was arguably in the 1990s and the noughties that interest in representations of Victorian London's socio-spatial divisions flourished across literary, journalistic, visual and other genres. And returning to an earlier theme, this included interesting contributions from scholars like Joe McLaughlin or John Marriott or Felix Driver, which explored the ways in which a colonial geographical imagination was mapped onto London's east-west divisions, most obviously and most blatantly in works like General William Booth's In Darkest England. But a fixation on the east-west dynamic among so many scholars has ended up replicating a Victorian obsession. Even a cursory glance at Charles Booth's maps suggests a more complex social geography. And what of other geographical dynamics? Why, to recall Nick Draper's observation, do historians of Victorian London, like taxi drivers, rarely go south of the river? And as my colleague here in English at Queen Mary, Matt Ingleby, and I tried to ask via a symposium we organised a few years ago, what if we look between the poles of East and West, or indeed beyond them? What can we learn there about social relationships and divisions? Moreover, there is a danger that some of this focus on representation seems to move us too far from the actual economic crises and material social divisions that were documented so vividly in Gareth's Outcast London. There's been a reaction against this particular kind of cultural turn in London writing. Thanks, Rob. And I would suggest a move away from studies of meaning and representation to a focus on understanding process, matter, and effect. So work on specific kinds of spaces, such as streets by Lynn Need or Peter K. Anderson, has allowed us to rethink questions of social polarity and distance, and to emphasize the fluidity of social identities and the opportunities for encounter that cities like London afforded. And studies that look at the mobility of London's populations, such as Seth Coven's slumming, for example, have reminded us that the problem of Outcast London was not unknown to middle-class Londoners, particularly where the apparent certainties of Victorian social politics were being upended by sexual politics. And to finish up then, in my own work too, I have tried, perhaps rather naively, to reach beyond the bourgeois imagination that provides the accounts of polarised London. What if we take our geographical focus right down to streets and households? And what if we try to read the lives of the poor through their material culture? And I had a lot of fun attempting to do this with colleagues at Museum of London Archaeology, working with assemblages of artefacts excavated from mid-century Limehouse's poorest streets. The glimpses you get are only fleeting, but here we can occasionally grasp the chronic instability, the intense mobility and transience, the making do and getting by, the sense of separation and loss of those living in a maritime setting, and the creative struggles, sheer graft and moments of taking pleasure that enabled some people in Victorian London to survive. Reading the material traces of lives otherwise barely documented is difficult, but for me it was Outcast London that in the end provided me with a framework to make sense of casual labour and endemic poverty at this micro-geographical scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've already got some really interesting comments coming in the comments box. So just to remind everybody, if you have a question that you would like to put to our panel or to Gareth, please do just pop that into the Q&A box and then I'll pose that for you later in the session. Our next speaker, though, is Susan Pennybacker, who teaches in the history department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her Cambridge PhD was supervised by Gareth, and that laid the foundations for much of her subsequent work, including a book called A Vision for London, 1889 to 1914. She is currently, I think, completing a book on refuge and exile in post-war London to be published by CUP. So thank you very much for joining us, Susan. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good evening. I'm honored, delighted to be here. I'm delighted also to actually be in London right now and to be seeing many people associated with the book and to get an opportunity to have some time with Gareth as well. I'm going to read my response in the interest of time, and obviously coming later in the panel, there are places where it overlaps with things that have already been said. So in his decisive introduction to Languages of Class, written in 1983, Gareth stated his specific central concern as the changing place attributed to the working classes or working class within the development of the polity. This deceptively simple statement of interest best summarizes for me the unity and direction, not just of the endeavor of Outcast London, but the direction of much of his subsequent work as a whole. Here lay fierce dissent from the dynastic houses governing British history in his younger years, the established axis of conservative and lib-lab aligned academically based practitioners, as well as the powerful and in their own way entrenched Marxist historians in and outside of the academy. The book began only 20 years after the war. It was published only 15 years after the Hungarian uprising. Neither the communist inheritance nor the British austerity welfare state, as David Edgerton has termed it, could sustain his political or scholarly vision. Outcast London, at least to my eyes, was a first effort to break what for him was the logjam of both a liberal paternalist embrace redolent in the historiography and the historical conjuring of a unified revolutionary proletariat before or after 1832 in the broad social and labor historiography of the left. By 1983, he averred that he had never perceived his early project as simply one of empirical research, nor one in which Marxism offered an adequate theoretical guide. And as we reread the panoramic and at the same time, about the panoramic and at the same time claustrophobic closed world of East London, largely abstracted from the metropolis around it, we see forces that mimic aspects of the ideational world in which the text was first written. A material reality faced by the London poor being addressed in ways ranging from the eugenicist extreme to philanthropic assistance with its varying requirements of social segregation and emulated moral instruction to sometimes shared views of a semi-organized left, mostly incapable of harnessing the rage or the resignation of those living at the bottom and failing to inculcate their schematic programmatic solutions, all referenced through the deep substructure of documentation contained in the parliamentary commissions and related documents that he consults, almost in an ethnographic fashion. The irony of this base in public documents is his own later admission that he did not focus on the weight of national politics or indeed of the state as a crucial arena of discourse and force for action. As this work expanded into the piece that became working class culture and working class politics, one could say that the celebrity surrounding both Outcast London and that particular article, beloved in North America where large crowds came to hear him read its music hall lyrics, was perhaps based in a hopeful sense for the new left inspired parts of the academy, in the belief that he was simply adapting Marxist analysis to the peculiarity of the late century and new century case of East London in interpreting the South African war enthusiasms and mafficking. That is, I think it was perceived still as a broadly Marxist project, but that there was an exception and it was London. His own credentials as a leading intellect of the English-speaking non-communist New Left were secure and widely known at this time. In the compelling final chapter of Familiar Stranger, Stuart Hall describes the founding of New University, the journal, recalling that it, quote, served to bring on figures such as Alexander Cockburn and Gareth Stedman Jones, adding, "It's easy to forget now that Universities Left Review and the NLR was primarily a political movement." This is Stuart speaking. The ULR Club held large political meetings every Monday evening in hotels in whatever places around central London we could afford, and on occasion at 100 Oxford Street, more famous as a dance venue. The first was addressed by Isaac Deutscher. None of us could believe the size of the turnout, maybe 600 or 700 people queued to get in. The political energies are not easily recalled today. Again, Stuart. Tom Mavoya was studying at Ruskin College, another big draw. We held meetings on NATO and South Africa, and of course would entice as many of our adversaries in the Labour Party as would consent to come. In this and other respects, the context for the writing of Outcast London involved a sequestering away from many issues of the era in which it was written, and indeed in which Gareth was deeply engaged. Its inattention to, for example, the demography of race or the implications of the mention of the sugar, coffee, and silk trades and their untapped potential that link the book to empire is striking to contemporary readers, as we've just heard. Yet the geopolitics surrounding the book were already suffused with the presence of the struggles of the global South. In stepping back from those into the haunted world of an empirically mapped, but also consciously chosen and imagined East London, the book asks that we look at the quotidian sentiment at the ground level and what was understood as its material sources. The South African War could be seen as a proxy, however narrow, for enthusiasm for empire, for the actual isolation of those who dissented from support for it, and for the absence of a consistent left class consciousness and any extension of that to a fervent anti-colonialism. 8 years after Outcast London, Thatcher's election in 1979 was followed in 1983 by the publication then of some parts of Rethinking Chartism, which then appeared in its transformative version in 1984. That piece and his introduction to languages of class asserted the primacy of language and its deconstruction, Europhile, as a forthright breakout in historical methodology, once more invoking his turn toward postmodernist theory. There was now an indelible sense in the work that the discursive formations that he was investigating were not governed by strict ontological class allegiances, that indeed there was no single working class, that the ascriptions of a revolutionary proletarian progression from the 1640s to the 1790s to the 1830s to the 1920s to the 1930s were not those that he was intent upon assisting, that the words, if you will, did not add up, that the state and the established political figures of the day projected a variety of motives instead, expressed in both language and action, and that these demanded new scrutiny, not dismissal. In introducing his Marx biography of 2016, 3 decades later, he states, consistent with the many approaches of the work in intellectual history that followed upon Outcast London, quote, the Marx celebrated from the 1890s and beyond was the theorist of the universality of capitalism and its inevitable global downfall. The aim of this book is to put Marx back into his 19th century surroundings before all these posthumous elaborations of his character and achievements, concluding that Marx and his contemporaries believed that history was a means by which progress could be measured. In closing, I circle back to the decade that immediately followed the publication of Outcast London. History Workshop Journal, with which many attending this session have deep ties, was a critical arena of expression of new work from many sectors in and outside of the academy, and above all, in its deepening engagement with feminist histories. In smaller ways, the social history seminar and self-help group that nourished much dialogue and debate in the mid to 70s to late 70s in Cambridge, and the leading roles in that setting taken up by the historians Jeff Ely, Jane Kaplan, Tony Judd, Istvan and Anna Hunt, herself trained as a sociologist, and the political theorist John Donne, amongst many others formally and informally, widened the lens of the research areas and mentorship and of the milieu into which Outcast London was read and reread in that Oxford context. The work of those in my student cohort and those whom we knew were numerous. Raj Chandavarkar's explorations of Bombay stand out as playing a leading role, as has been said. Work followed recently by Sheetal Shabria's Making the Modern Slum. The exploration of notions of skill and of the labor aristocracy by Alastair Reid, the ways in which the idea of the criminal was explored and challenged by Jennifer Davis, and David Feldman's treatment of Jewish labor established the first comprehensive account mentioned throughout the original text. Some of us, I'm coming to an end, Robert, formed the London group of historians that met in the German Historical Institute in Holborn. The late Susanna Deppmer, Jim Gillespie and Tom Jeffrey working on the interwar era, and Jennifer Davis, David Feldman, Dina Koppelman, John Davis, Deborah Wiener, John Marriott, all involved in various kinds of revisions or challenges to the issues forecast in Outcast London. I would especially recall of academic enterprises of that first 15 years, lying apart from History Workshop and other publications in the body of transatlantic scholarship that's noted in the Verzo editions and the introductions reproduced there. Avner Offer's fine studied Property and Politics, and the endeavors of the architectural historians Andrew Saint and Robert Thorne. And finally, the recent magisterial Underground Asia by Tim Harper, which offers a crucial, important vista on how London worked, appeared, and was perceived. Those gathered here today bear witness to the enormously widespread spark of memory that the very mention of the text elicits. In the US, we've seen and see Donald Trump and Jared Kushner on the political landscape, slumlords in profits and politics. The latter's family enterprise bought buildings meant for public housing, reselling them at prices unaffordable to the African-American intended constituencies, thereby blocking Black voting access to important jurisdictions. We see the US Congress haggling over ostensibly free and immoral handouts to the poor. Service sector workers using the COVID dividends to try to find other more remunerative jobs in order to gain basic access to food, to healthcare and housing. We see the dispersal, segregation, repatriation, incarceration, and abandonment of refugees and migrants in the US border, in the Mediterranean, in the Channel. The message of Outcast London remains: the abolition of poverty in the First World and the Global South, in the former Soviet world and in East Asia, is not yet upon us, and our historical work still bears out that dilemma. We are regrettably still never far from the challenges the book poses in the fundamental truths of its structural assessments, and even more so, its urgent spirit of revelation and disclosure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We move now to our final panelist, who is also at Queen Mary, and is Dr. Rob Waters. Rob is a lecturer in modern British history, and his first book, Thinking Black, Britain 1964 to 1985, was published to great acclaim in 2018, and he's currently finishing a second book on race and integration in mid-20th century Britain. So, Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rob. So, I was really pleased to be asked to speak on this panel and to have the opportunity to return to Outcast London and to think about it actually in ways that I hadn't beforehand. But when I say return to it, I have to admit with a sense of shame that this is a very belated return. And I think I last read Outcast London in full as an undergraduate in the early 2000s. It was always languages of class that held a bigger role in my own thinking. But anyway, since I hadn't read Outcast London for so long, I thought it'd be best to begin preparing for this panel by seeing what Gareth had to say about it in the interim. So I began with reading that 2013 preface, which was written, I think, to mark the book's 40th anniversary. And I was surprised, although perhaps I shouldn't have been, to see Gareth describe his main interest at the time he was writing Outcast London in the second half of the 1960s to be the economics and politics of development in what was at the time called the Third World. And more than this, he described the impact of the image of Brazil's shantytowns, the favelas, which he'd encountered reading Levi Strauss's Triste Tropique. And you can probably imagine how this piqued my interest. Here's this classic text of English social history focused on Victorian London and particularly on the East End, exactly that terrain that would hold the attention of so many of the new left historians of the 70s and 80s. And yet it comes via the shanty towns of Brazil. It came via the politics of third world development. It came from the moment of third worldism, from the moment of what Richard Drayton's termed secondary decolonisation, when those shanty towns moved to the centre of decolonisation politics, drawing attention to the limits of the political settlements for constitutional sovereignty that were the inheritance of the anti-colonial independence struggles. And for those of you who know me and my work, this is exactly the kind of thing that fired my imagination. But there's a catch in this reading, because if you check through the footnotes to Outcast London, there's no mention of Tristan Tropique, no mention even of Levi Strauss, and certainly no mention of Brazilian shantytowns. So it got me thinking, where do we find the connection between Levi Strauss's favelas and Gareth Stedman Jones's Victorian London? And reading back over Outcast London, I was struck by how easily I could read its narrative through the lens of its contemporary post-colonial politics, even while that lens was never explicitly offered in the text. In many respects in Outcast London, we have a vision of a new liberalism and Fabianism driven ultimately by a fear of the casual poor. And for the liberals and the Fabians, this was, as Gareth puts it, the unregenerated poor, those who turned their backs on progress or had been rejected by it. This was a poor who were understood as alien and alienated, they were volatile and violent, and as Gareth tells it, the story of their containment and disciplining is the other side to the story of the incorporation of the so-called respectable working class in the era of franchise reform and expanding social provision. And this social residuum were deemed constitutionally, even racially, incapable of a similar incorporation to that which the so-called respectable working class were afforded. They were a headache for the new liberal and Fabian reformers, and they were also a threat, as 1886 showed, and they were dealt with punitively. What we see in all of this is how within the structures of the modern political nation being forged in the late 19th century, the production of new citizens worked in tandem with the production of uncitizens, those deemed incapable of taking on the mantle of citizenship. I think the parallels with the stories of colonial and indeed post-colonial political modernity perhaps don't need to be set out. But I'll only say that reading Outcast London with this lens was a strangely familiar experience. As I was reading it, I was thinking of another history that's dominated my reading in recent months, David Scott's analysis of Norman Manley's vision of political modernity in Jamaica and the sorry fate of the Rastafarians and rude boys of Trenchtown in that story. And yet, as I say, the connections between the history of this old imperial centre and the history of the post-colonial peripheries remains displaced or silenced in the text of Outcast London itself. The shanty town is only a shadow presence in Outcast London. The urgency of secondary decolonisation registers perhaps at one level, at the conceptual, perhaps even the imaginative, but at another level, in the actual body of the text, in the content, it's nowhere to be seen. So I thought I'd close with a different encounter with Outcast London. I said I hadn't really returned to the book since undergraduate days, but it's a book that's continued to return to me. It's returned via another text, Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and his colleagues at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which I've spent more hours than I care to remember reading and rereading. And I think the connection between Policing the Crisis and Outcast London's important. One of the things that's always fascinated me about Policing the Crisis is its final chapter, which attempts to read a vernacular black political culture in 1970s Britain, at a time when most commentators either refused to believe that such a thing existed, or will want to either caricature it or to reduce it to the orthodoxies of stricter varieties of Marxism. Policing the Crisis offered a different way of seeing that black political culture. It's presented as inhabiting what the authors call a colony space, in the heart of the former imperial metropole, a space which Policing the Crisis reads through the writing of Frantz Fanon. But we reach this point of Fanonian colony life in English inner cities only at the end of Policing the Crisis, and there's a lot of scaffolding that takes us there. And one of the crucial routes we take to reach the colony space is through the Victorian social history, and specifically through Outcast London. And I think there's a reason that Outcast London could offer the authors of Pleasing the Crisis a way into reading the inner city as a colony space. If the shanty town appears only in displaced form in Outcast London, Pleasing the Crisis offers a more direct engagement with it to explain the inner city as a colony area, but it does so by going back through that original displaced articulation. And for me, what's invigorating about seeing Outcast London in this frame is the way in which it helps us to understand the formation of a particular and particularly important moment in English social history that presents it as in some manner made possible by its post-colonial context. Now, I'm not suggesting exactly that we should read Outcast London as a post-colonial text, but, and this is the final point I'm making, reading it through its post-colonial frame allows us a useful way of registering one of the effects of decolonisation within the intellectual history of the old metropole itself. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to all of our panelists who have given us a tremendous amount to think about, and I think have really demonstrated just how many different intellectual hairs can be started by a book that is in its 50th year. We're going to move very shortly to our Q&A session. So please do put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We've got a couple already, but the more the merrier. So please do share your thoughts and your ideas with us. But before we do that, I want to invite the star of this evening's festivities, Gareth Stedman-Jones, to respond to what he's just heard, perhaps some of the things that have been said, and to give us his own reflections on Outcast London at 50. But you're still muted, Gareth.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely, loud and clear.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Robert, for chairing this. And thank you, Sunil, Emma, Thomas, Alastair, Susan, and Rob for giving such generous accounts of what the book was trying to do, and why it might still be worthy of reading. They've said so much, I can't possibly do justice to all they've said. Let me just highlight one or two things. Yes, I'm very flattered that Sunil picked up the climate issue in the book, because I was fascinated at the time to find, you know, what the frozen Thames meant to the London economy and so on. You know, to chart it in a sort of longer term way. In relation to what Emma said, I very much liked the way in which she highlighted the fact that, you know, parts 1, 2, and 3 of the book are all intertwined, and that there isn't just separation. And I think there I'd just sort of say that my motto has always been actually not Marx but Hegel, and the truth is the whole, and that's also why I dislike being more specialized than simply being called a historian. Yes, I didn't, on the question of immigration, I didn't sort of highlight it in the way that it probably would be highlighted and ought to be highlighted now. Of course, I talked about the Jewish immigration of the 1880s, but I probably didn't give enough salience to that. But it's, but what it did do is to sort of make the connection between the between London and the international. Then when, sorry, I'm just looking through my notes. Well, I also liked the way that the part 1 was highlighted in some cases, because looking at the book now, it just seemed to me that an enormous amount of work went into trying to chart how the casual labour market worked and how the economics of the economy worked, and to connect that with the debates which happened, or not connect, to how debate proceeded among the Victorian liberals and so on, who I deal with in part 3. Just looking. I mean, what I'd also just say is that even though it was written in the end of the 1960s, so of course there would be the need to address the predominant issues as they had been raised by people like Eric Hobsbawm and Edward Thompson and so on, and thus Marxism plays a role as well. But it wasn't one which, in a way, was slightly counter that, in that, you know, the London working class really was a sort of a non-heroic symbol of classes, except of course it had its wonderful moment in 1889. But I really wanted to stress the otherness of class from the sort of more heroic or conventionally social democratic accounts which you find in labour history. Interesting too that, you know, the geographical aspect was so emphasized. I found that absolutely fascinating at the time, and I was very struck as a researcher in finding that the most interesting work from my point of view when I was researching the book had been done by geographers, and yet at the time there was almost a sort of historians didn't pay any attention to geographers. So it was both exciting and unfamiliar, and I'm very glad that that sort of came through. And of course, I didn't deal in any sort of any direct way with ethnicity in the book, and that's something which obviously one would deal with if one was looking at these same problems now. But I think, well, that's just the result of having written it 50 years ago. It all feels very strange, I must say, looking at it again today. But thank you all very much for your appreciation and some of the criticisms, which I'll certainly take to heart. But I don't want to take any more time now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. What I'm going to do now is take some of the questions that have been coming in, and I'll bundle them together and then invite each of our panelists perhaps to pick one that they would like to respond to, or if they prefer, perhaps to respond to something that either Gareth has said or that one of the other panelists has said. So we have a question from Alastair Reed, who says that it is very stimulating to hear so many positive methodological legacies of this book, but is Outcast London not an essentially negative work? That middle-class social reform was a way of re-establishing squirearchy and deference in a metropolitan environment, or that the working people of London failed to become a revolutionary proletariat? In that sense, should we see it as a detailed case study of the Anderson-Nairn thesis in a New Left review? We've also got some questions about method. Perhaps one way to put them together is to take the subtitle of this book. The subtitle is A Study in the Relationship Between Classes. Now, of course, a lot of writing about class has gone out of fashion, but this book hasn't. So is there anything about the way that it deals with class that perhaps explains its longevity, or that we might wish to develop today? We've also got a question from B. Wilson, who says, in what ways is the Outcast London of the book different from Outcast London or New York or Mumbai today? And then finally, a question that's directed particularly to Gareth. To what extent did Outcast London inspire your subsequent book, An End to Poverty? Did you write An End to Poverty to explain the deep-seated endemic poverty that Outcast London described? So perhaps if we go in the same order again, perhaps just take one of those questions because of pressure of time. And so we'll start with you, Sunil.
Thanks. I mean, I'll just speak very briefly to B. Wilson's wonderful question about the differences as much as the similarities in terms of Outcast London, Mumbai, which I perhaps know more about, New York. Clearly, the occupational structure is different. I mean, one of the very striking things is, of course, the precarious labor force in a lot of coastal cities today. Certainly doesn't work on the docks because container ports employ very few people. I think the scale of migration in relation to the whole sort of apparatus of citizenship is very different. I mean, this is a whole history, which I think, you know, some of our fellow panelists have gestured to. There's a whole global history of border control, which really separates the period of Outcast London from the particular kinds of pressures that bear on the migrant labor force in most global cities today in terms of, you know, documentation or the status of being undocumented, which is of course such a major thing here in the United States and certainly in Outcast New York. So I'll just leave it there. I mean, I think sort of not just the patterns of migration, but also the regulation of migration, I think is clearly a major difference. The occupational structure would be another.
Goodness, I guess that's me next. There's so many, so much that all the other speakers picked up on, and Gareth pointed out so many different questions as well that we've got there. I suppose I don't even know which one to go for because there's so much to say. I suppose the idea about it being a negative book, I suppose that it just really jars with me. I suppose and I mean, I thought one of the things that's really interesting, and one of the things I thought would be really interesting coming in was that people are going to say completely different things, and for me it just seems so obvious the important bit, and even just kind of picking out the book again, all the bits the way I've penciled, I mean, it just seems obvious to me that anybody would go to those bits, and I knew that people would speak to completely different parts of the book, and they have spoken to completely different parts of the book as well. And is it a negative book? I don't view it as a negative book. That's not for me the word I would use. Is there a pessimism, or is there a pessimism in the book? Yes, I think there is a pessimism in the book. Is there a kind of a dark interpretation kind of lurking in the book? Yes, I think there is. But for me, I don't view it in quite the way that Alastair has outlined it there. I think for me, that the pessimism, or you know, that kind of negativity is a takedown of the idea of progress, that everything is getting better. And that when we moved into the 20th century, we marched towards the welfare state, and this was kind of a very positive step. And the things that were happening, the changes of the way poverty was going to be handled in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, this is all a march towards progress, and it's a sign of things getting better. So I think there's a more kind of pessimistic and a much darker interpretation that's inherent in the book. And I think that's probably why it was also, you know, I think why it was a stimulating book, to think that these things that have always been viewed as progress and as a step towards better times, and that there might be kind of dark interpretations and darker motives inherent and kind of lying behind them. But negative isn't the, I'll leave it there. But for me, negative, no. But is there something dark and pessimistic about it? Yes, I think there is something in that, yeah.
Well, I would first just say I agree with Sunil's points about migration and the control of migration. And Outcast London takes place sort of right at, or it's focused on a period right at the end of a very uncontrolled moment in British immigration history, which comes to an end in 1905 and then with the First World War. But just very briefly, I suppose maybe I would combine my responses to Alastair's and B's questions. As Emma has just said, there are kind of pessimistic strands in the book, and certainly when it comes to you know, the sort of missed opportunity of London becoming London sort of becoming host to a revolutionary proletariat, that's very starkly put and in the last chapter of the book. But the chapter before that actually has something of a positive or optimistic note to it. There's almost a kind of technological deus ex machina, which comes in the 1890s as railway provision becomes cheaper and more reliable and more copious, which allows a lot of the overcrowding in the central districts to begin a process of spreading out. And then the First World War comes along and soaks up most of the unemployed of London. And London after the First World War has a more buoyant labor market than the more sort of struggling, soon to be post-industrial areas of Northern England. And that sort of expansion of London physically maybe is one of the kind of key differences with the Outcast London in the 1880s. In Outcast London, Gareth writes about the building of the speculative, often building of suburbs in places like, I don't know, Camberwell in the south and getting into sort of East Ham in the east, but which fails to attract, for a variety of reasons, enough inhabitants. And there's a sort of plague of empty houses around the perimeter of London. But the London of Outcast London feels very geographically constrained. Whereas now, of course, London is a geographically enormous city. And although rent, as B picked up in her question, is often more expensive as a proportion of one's income in much of London today than then, I suppose the trade-off is people are not living 12 to a room, or 2-story, 3-story houses are not divided between several families. So there's been sort of a much less of an intense pressure on the square footage of the housing in the city. So I think that would be my response to the two questions.
And maybe I might pick up that question about why is it that Outcast London is still popular and relevant, and class as an analytical category within history is not, or why do we not write about class as much as we did? And fairly short answer, I suppose. To me, it is about the way that Gareth deals with class in the book, and to just echo something Emma was saying earlier on, the way that the book is integrated, that the economic at the beginning and the kind of social, and the connection of those different themes through the book, the attentiveness to actually questions of geography. So this is a very sensitive way of dealing with class as a kind of analytical category, which I suppose you could argue, allows Gareth's book to dodge some of the critiques of the importance of class in social history that we were all debating back in the 90s, the kind of Patrick Joyce kind of stuff. So there's that. I mean, there are probably many answers to this question. I think the other thing that we've been saying quite a lot in this discussion is how there are echoes right now of what was happening in the later 19th century. So as we see the continuing significance of class now, then that enables us also to recognise its importance back in the later 19th century.
Susan, would you like to come in here?
No, I think I'll pass in the interest of time.
Okay, thank you. Rob, how about you?
I'll only say very, very quick things, which are to do with the question about the Outcast London of today and of the one that Gareth gave us of the 19th century. I think the big difference for me is, it may be the case that it was a multi-ethnic city back in the 19th century, but I really go with the description that the sociologist Luc de Noronha gives of multi-status being the main kind of issue that divides, that best captures the diversity of the city today. And we now live in a city in which precarity, casualisation, and everything else is tied to status so closely for so many people. And we live in a city in which your status is constantly checked, a city in which bordering is kind of a part of everyday life for the kind of racialised poor. And I think that's the big difference, really.
Thank you. Gareth, would you like to respond to the question about whether An End to Poverty was, in a sense, a sequel to Outcast London? And I wonder if I could just throw in another question as well, which is, I was chatting to a colleague earlier this week, and we were reflecting that in our own much shorter academic careers, we're already conscious of having changed as historians and having changed in the way that we write. And so I wondered whether you've revised Outcast London at various points, but if you were sitting down to write a sequel to it now or beginning it again, what would you do differently, do you think? What different approaches might you perhaps take?
Well, thank you. I mean, I suppose what I would, End to Poverty was really not connected. I mean, it wasn't meant to be a sequel to Outcast London. It addressed some really quite different issues, and it had a more, optimistic cast, if you like, than the original book. And on the question of whether the book's pessimistic or not, I think, well, it wasn't intended like that, and it certainly wasn't intended to vindicate Anderson Nairn theses about the English polity. Yes, they tried to create a new squirearchy in the East End, but it didn't work. I'd also want to, as I think Alastair, or was it Rob? I can't remember. Anyway, highlighted. That the finale may sound a bit pessimistic, but the penultimate chapter actually was quite upbeat. The changes that happened in the 1890s and 1900s, and I'd also want to add to that after all, it was a prelude to a period between the 1930s and the 1960s when, the welfare state really took over a lot of the problems dealt with in the book. And I think if I was feeling sort of pessimistic when I wrote it, it was much more how the new poor law treated people, and if there's an issue about classes, it's really an issue about poverty, and how poverty was penalized rather than cured, and how at the end of the book you do get a more optimistic picture of release from some of the things described in my treatment of casual labor.
Thank you. Can I just put two other questions to you, Gareth, as I come into the question box? First, we got a question from Erica Rappaport, who is interested in how gender historians have built upon and/or challenged the view of the working class developed in Outcast London, and particularly mentions Ellen Ross's Love and Labour and Outcast London. So, wonders if you had any views on gender and the portrait you gave in that book of the working class. Also, a question from Gabriel Winant, who says that while I appreciate the specific context of debates within and beyond Marxism that the book marked out as its origin, I wonder whether it now has an ironic coincidence with more recent trends in a less workerist Marxism, and mentions a number of scholars, including Michael Denning, Aaron Bananev, Mike Davis, and Eileen Boris, people who emphasize the growing disjunction between accumulation and employment. Is this a surprising congruency? Is it Outcast London's influence, or what should we make of it?
Gosh, well, on the first issue about gender, of course, in the light of feminist and other historiography since the 1980s and so on, it looks very minimal, the attention given to gender in the book. That's a bit disappointing for me, because at the time I felt rather proud of myself as devoting what would seem unusual amount of attention to gender, particularly how the female casual labour problem operated in the labour market, as well as the male. And I tried to treat it as affecting family men and women, and not just male unemployment. However, I mean, I can quite understand that it looks pretty sparse and minimal compared with the later attention which might have been given to it. On the question about whether there's some relationship between a certain sort of Marxism and what I wrote, a certain sort of Marxism today and what I wrote, if there is, it's not one that's really known to me. I mean, this is written in a very different climate, and so I don't think it relates, anyway, deliberately, with any of the writers that you mentioned in the question.
Thank you. I think Emma is keen to come in.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, well, I mean, obviously a book written in the 1970s looks very different from the book that one would write today. And I think for the time it was written, I think it did loads to bring in, and I think again in like a very seamless way. So it wasn't a book all about women, and it wasn't women's history, but for a book that was written at this time, I think it did a lot. You know, it was remarkably progressive in the amount of attention that it did provide, you know, that does shed on women's lives. And I think very much in kind of the way all of the different strands are woven together. There's not like a standalone chapter and standalone parts like now we'll go and look at the women's history, but it's all just part of the story and part of the household. And I think just one other thing I'd say about the book, it's wonderful to come back and to think about a book that's been really influential. But part of the reason a book is really influential is because it encourages lots of other people to pick up the themes and to look at them through a different kind of prism. And I like the example of Ellen Ross's book, which is, I think, a fantastic book written. I wouldn't for a moment say it couldn't have been written without that book, but like all of us, we kind of respond to what's out there already, and some wonderful ideas were put out there. And I just think maybe it's another way of thinking about how history develops, that it's very collaborative, and that we, you know, fields take the shape that they do because of one very significant book, but also because of all the other voices that come in and work around that. And so I kind of take exception to the idea that it wasn't a book about women and there was nothing in there. I think actually it encouraged lots of gender historians to think about things in new ways, and it did for it. Yeah, it does contain lots about women as well.
Thank you very much. I should say that Erica has added a comment making clear that she wasn't suggesting that it lacked attention to women, but rather was interested in the ways that this has shaped women's history subsequently. I think there are all kinds of other things that we could discuss, but I'm conscious that we've crashed past 8 o'clock. So I think it's time that we drew proceedings to a close. But I think it's been a wonderful celebration this evening. But it hasn't just been a celebration of a book written 50 years ago. It's also shown us how much new thinking and how many new avenues of research have flown out of this, and how we should, as historians, perhaps maintain more of a dialogue between books written at different points in time than we're sometimes inclined to do. So if you've read the book, I hope that this evening has given you some new ideas and some new ways of thinking about it. If you haven't, I hope it's inspired you to get hold of a copy. It really is a wonderful read and has so much to contribute to so many different disciplines. I'd like to end by thanking all of you for coming this evening. I think we've had more than 150 people with us tonight, which is fantastic to see. I'd like to thank our 6 panelists for giving up their time and for giving us so many interesting ideas. And above all, thank you to Gareth for writing such a magnificent book and for coming out and talking about it with us this evening. Thank you also to the Mile End Institute, the Raphael Samuel Centre, and the Modern British History Seminar for hosting this evening's event. And we hope to see you back at Mile End Institute events in the future. Thank you very much and have a good evening.